Hello and welcome to the Shaun Johnson experiment. Shaun left a comment on the video I recently uploaded and commented about Seekers and their power currently in the game. I told him if that was so, I would go and test playing alone with a counter build for Seeker mines and upload it and call it the Shaun Johnson experiment. First of all, I'd like to say that the feedback and open dialogue throughout the comments of the previous video is encouraging, seeing so many people politely disagreeing with me and one another on different topics revolving around the new patch and the state of the current PvP. Was to say the least surprising and something you just don't see right now almost anywhere, especially here in the United States. Things get solved a lot better by open discussion, and I would like to continue that open dialogue with one another again in this video, talking about countering Seeker mines and some of the evolving dynamics between character types that I see currently and would like to see even more of moving forward. So the Shaun Johnson experiment is very simple. I threw on 4 pieces of final measure and went to PvP and seen what happened. Finding players using Seeker mines currently was quite easy given the current state of the game a few weeks in. What I expected from final measure based on previous playtime and last stand while using Seekers was about what I got. I expected 2 things to essentially happen since the things considered overpowered exist in 2 main states in the current form. A lot of super high DPS players rocking 8k to 9.5k firearms, mainly using Deadeye and some using other versions, and the other half of the players running Seeker Mine Tactician builds or skill power builds of some sort, and some combining that with explosive damage across the board. From this current layout of character builds, I expected to be dominant versus skill players, given that I was able to counter their only real damage, which exists in the form of exotic damage in its various forms, and I expected to have real issues versus their very high DPS players. Because I was going to be playing alone and not in a team, I did not want to be great versus one player and be getting melted versus another, so I went with a balanced build across the board with stats into firearms, stamina, and electronics, effectively running around 160,000 skill power, a little over 250,000 DPS on the character stream, and 340,000 toughness. Effectively, I expected to out DPS some of the poorer players running DPS builds and winning some of those fights. Win almost all fights against all skill power players, and lose almost all fights against high DPS players that were skillful. I would counter the greatest strength of skill power players with final measure, and attack the greatest weakness of low toughness players who likely had a low exotic damage resilience by running a less powerful Seeker mine or turret to attack them and still do decent DPS to finish them off. And those were pretty much the results. When I had a map of high skill power players, I was extremely powerful, rushing Seekers and taking the damage and melting them down with decent DPS and my own decent exotic damage, effectively rendering them useless. I had mixed results versus high DPS players. They were definitely my weakness by far, but less skilled players I was able to overcome. Only one skill power player gave me problems, and he must have been a complete one-trick pony, as I took some pretty crazy damage versus his Seekers sometimes. But the most important revelation here was the ineffectiveness of Seekers and grenades to my teammates, and in skill power dominated teams our team crushed the opposition, and one utility build on the team transformed the very powerful skill power damage in the game from Seekers and other means to a much more controlled amount of damage for everyone on my team. What we should take from this is what I hinted to in the last video, and that is that instead of nerfing things constantly, we should allow the players to fill this out for a while with regards to Seeker mines, and players should be adjusting their builds. I heard today that the devs have suggested that they may nerf the damage on Seeker mines. It may need a small damage nerf, I am not sure yet. The damage combined with the stagger probably does need to be looked at, but this is the warning I will give and the final thought I will leave you with to respond to. Currently, the main weakness of players running 9,000 firearms and such low toughness is the risk of them being one-shot by a skill power player. One of the reasons that so many are getting one-shot is due to running 280,000 toughness with no healer or teammates around. And in my opinion, the mentality of many players in the community, like I spoke about in the last video, is that they want to kill everything that moves all day long. If you start nerfing skill power skills that counter these types of glass cannon builds, given the difficulty of gaining damage mitigation to counter such builds, since armor was removed, on the move was nerfed, as well as critical save, I believe that we're just going to go back down a road where we all end up stacking up firearms and running the same builds once again, just as before. In today's meta, which is Thursday the 16th, we have skill power player who is the weakness of these high DPS builds with extremely low toughness. We have a utility player running final measure who is the weakness of the skill power player, and a DPS player who is the weakness of the final measure user. Even some of the DPS players have obviously started speccing more into enemy armor damage resistance or exotic damage resistance than before, effectively bringing down the damage both skills and DPS players are doing. And you should see that this type of counter to high DPS low stam builds and high skill power low stam builds starts to put more emphasis on stamina itself, which is something many have avoided altogether just a few days ago and still do. But I think this type of countering and naturally shifting meta is very healthy for the game. This is meta shifting naturally in the game. What you would hope to expect is that more players would be willing to run such a build countering skill power, and skill power will back off a bit, and then maybe final measure will not be as needed as much, and we will find a new balance. And from these moving parts, perhaps another form of a build will emerge that is a type of hybrid or something different that fits into whatever we are a week or two from now. Effectively, we may end up running more stamina based on this type of movement. I also can't stress enough how much easier Seekers are to deal with if you have a dedicated healer. And I understand that many players are playing solo, but in Last Stand we are all on a team guaranteed. So play as one. Have multiple builds ready, and hopefully we'll be able to switch these out on the fly soon, which is a more important change in my opinion than nerfing the Seeker mines currently. So my conclusion of Shaun Johnson's experiment. I think they should buff Final Measure to even further counter skill players. Make it more defensive against skill power damage in some form. Add some exotic damage on the 4-piece so that only the 4-piece users get it perhaps. Make it diffuse Seekers and diffuse all Seekers that split into parts when one is diffused perhaps. Taking exotic damage grants your teammates some exotic damage perhaps added to the 4th piece. I'm not sure. And try to play with your teammates better in groups to offset some of the issues you're having. Play more utility roles that counter current meta, and play more healing roles to offset both the high DPS builds and the exotic damage builds that are existing in the game right now. But don't nerf exotic damage into the ground, or we are going to all be running around with 9,000 firearms and a self-heal very soon, and we are going to be back to square one, in my opinion. So let me know what your thoughts are on the subject in the comments below, and voice your opinion about continually nerfing things instead of buffing other items to counter them, or expecting the player base to counter their own current issues with their builds. But without exotic damage builds, in my opinion, diversity is going to die. Thanks again to everyone who commented on the last video, and thanks to all that decided to subscribe and those that decided to resubscribe over the past few days. I will talk to you later, and I will talk to you in the comments. Let's go. Take it easy.